No, sir.
Any member of the commission have any comments? If not, next item is approval of minutes, May 14, 2015. Have you had a chance to consider them, and do you have any motion?
Motion to approve.
By Mr. Stewart, and a second by Ms. Calderon. Any discussion of the minutes? If not, all in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, like sign? Hearing none, the motion carries. The next item on the agenda, item 4, is a public hearing. Orchid Cave LLC request to rezone plus or minus 41.95 acres located east of US 1 and north of 82nd Street from CG, General Commercial District, to OCR, Office Commercial Residential District. This is a quasi-judicial matter, and I understand that you've got a request from the applicant to postpone this matter until August 13, 2015. Is that correct, Mr. Bowman?
That's correct.
I see from the applicant's request that they are willing to pay for renoticing of an August 13 date. And I know traditionally we have opened the hearing, then considered the motion to continue, with the idea that advertising costs would not be incurred a second time. Is that right?
That's correct.
Okay. Do you have any preference as to whether we follow that traditional path or whether we just consider it without opening the hearing, and in which case it would be renoticed back later on?
I think it would be appropriate to open the public hearing and continue it to August 13, 7 p.m.
Which is the way it has traditionally.
Correct.
Okay. We'll go ahead and open the public hearing, and the first item of the public hearing will be a consideration of the applicant's request for a postponement until August 13, 2015. Members of the commission, do you have any comments? Mr. Bowles, any comments?
No, sir.
Any objection to the proposal?
We've had none. We have tried to alert, of course, not only the applicant, but any interested parties that we're aware of.
Okay. Has anybody objected?
No.
If so, we then have a motion to postpone this matter until August 13, 2015.
Motion to postpone the matter to August 13, 2015.
Such a motion by Mr. Renato. Do we have a second?
I'll second that.
Any discussion? All in favor, please signify by aye. Aye. Any opposed? Like sign. Hearing none, motion carries. The matter is continued. And therefore, I guess we would not close the public hearing today.
Yeah, I don't think it makes any difference. You'll just reopen the public hearing at a later date.
We'll go ahead and close it. We understand that this will continue August 13, 2015. That brings us to item 4B, also a public hearing. The matter as follows: consideration of proposed amendments to county sea protection lighting regulations and development regulations, section 901.03, definitions, section 932.09, sea protection. This is a legislative matter. Vote.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. For the record, Stan Bowling, County Community Development Director. I'm going to turn it over to Roland DuBois, our Chief of Environmental Planning, and he'll make staff's presentation.
Thank you. For the record, I am Roland DuBois, Chief of Environmental Planning and Code Enforcement for the county. I do have an overhead presentation. As mentioned, it's a proposal of amendments to the county sea turtle protection lighting regulations. Just some background. Back in October, there's a code enforcement citation was issued to an owner of a Barrier Island residence for sea turtle protection lighting violations. The allegation was unscreened interior house lighting visible from the beach after 9 p.m. during sea turtle nesting season. The code of the county code section applicable is under Chapter 932, the county's coastal management regulations, particularly a section related to existing development. I have it on the overhead. Essentially, to meet the intent of the section, lighting of existing structures which can be seen from the beach shall be in compliance with the following: window treatments and windows facing the ocean of single and multi-story structures required so that interior lights do not illuminate the beach. the use of tint or film on windows or awnings is preferred. However, use of blackout draperies or shade screens will suffice. So the citation had to do with this particular section as it applied to the residents in question. The owner appealed the citation that was issued by staff, appealed it to the Code Enforcement Board under Code Enforcement Procedures, and the citation was overturned on appeal after a hearing where the board considered evidence and testimony. One of the findings, at least from staff's perspective, that the board made, they weren't very specific as to each particular finding, but it was apparent to staff that one of the issues was light emanating from north-facing windows on the residence and not facing the ocean. And it appears that the factor was whether or not the light was visible from the beach. The fact that those windows were not facing the ocean, it was deemed not to be a violation. Subsequent to that, in April, the Board of County Commissioners, under Commissioner Matters, had a discussion on the county code and what was an apparent discrepancy between windows facing the ocean or versus can be seen from the beach. And as a result of that discussion by the county commissioners, there was a directive to county staff to draft some revisions to the ordinance to delete the references to facing the ocean and replace it with a language of in line of sight of the ocean or the beach. Also, there was a direction to look into the extending the area of restricted illumination to include not only the beach but dune areas. Since that time, staff has looked into the matter, have drafted some revisions that are here for the commission to consider. In doing so, we made a comparison with other ordinances. We looked at the state model ordinance, which there is a state model ordinance for sea turtle lighting criteria. It's Florida Administrative Code 62B55. It was included in the commission members' backup. We also looked at other local ordinances in the region. We looked at Vero Beach, Indian River Shores. We also looked at Brevard, St. Lucie, and Martin County ordinances. What I'm showing on overhead now is just some comparative language of those different ordinances. In this first slide, we're showing Indian River County current and proposed language as compared to the state model ordinance. We look at, in these tables, it's set up to look at two things: how illumination is defined or described in each of the ordinances, and then the specific section related to interior lighting and existing structures, which was the issue of the case that led to this action. Under the current Indian River County ordinance, if you see under illumination, it references light source visible from 2 feet or less in height on the beach or creates a discernible shadow. Indian River County's had its regulations since the late 80s, and I believe the 2 feet above or less in height was intended to be a perspective of a sea turtle, because essentially that's a location where they would be on the beach. So that's why that's in there. In looking at the other ordinances and statewide, however, what we found as staff is that that's a unique provision within our ordinance compared to others. We could not find any similar reference in other ordinances. With related to interior lighting under the existing code, again, it says lighting which can be seen from the beach, but related to window treatments for windows facing the ocean. Under the proposed language, would be to change the 2 feet, to eliminate the 2 feet or less height from the beach. Just change it to visible to an observer on the beach, which we'll see as we look at the other comparisons is consistent with the other ordinances and state model ordinance. We're also looking at revising the section on interior lighting for existing structures to be changed to within line of sight of an observer on the beach. If you look at the bottom row of the overhead, That's the state model language. It specifically references under direct illuminated definition, artificial light, which is visible to an observer on the beach. So what is proposed to be changed would be consistent with that language. The interior lighting of existing structures, again, so the state model ordinance references to shielding of interior lights from the beach. When you look at the local ordinances nearby for Vero Beach and Indian River Shores, Vero Beach currently defines illumination as brightness detectable to an observer standing anywhere on the beach. And they also reference under the interior lighting, if it's within direct line of sight of the beach, be subject to the window treatments. Indian River Shores is a little bit different. They reference, they focus on the detectable shadow on the beach as a result of illumination. And they do not directly regulate interior lighting of dwellings in Indian River Shores, but they have language in their ordinance to recommend that residents be mindful of the potential adverse effects. Brevard County, it appears they essentially adopted the state model ordinance language verbatim with reference to visibility, visible to an observer on the beach, and with shielding of interior lighting from the beach. And St. Lucie and Martin County could not actually find a definition of illumination, but they do have the interior lighting provisions with reference to St. Lucie uses the line of sight of the beach language. Martin County just requires all windows of single and multifamily stories to be treated to prevent illumination of the beach. So what I'm showing now is the actual language of the current and proposed. Again, under the county's current definition of illuminate, you can see the highlighted language with reference to the 2 feet or less in height on the beach area. What we're proposing under the revisions is to eliminate the 2-foot height or less and to replace it with visible to an observer on the beach. Under existing development window treatments, the current language, again, it references window treatments to windows facing the ocean of single and multi-story structures. What we're proposing under this amendment is to change it to within line of sight of an observer on the beach. The other direction that was discussed and given to staff to evaluate was inclusion of dune areas in the area of restricted illumination. When we looked at that, staff's conclusion after some review is that inclusion of the dunes would be inconsistent with the state model and with other local ordinances, county or statewide. And our finding was that none of the ordinances include the dune in the illumination restriction area. And from the model ordinance that the state puts out through the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, it's apparently not necessary to provide the adequate protection based on that model ordinance. Inclusion of the dunes would also effectively eliminate lighting that is currently allowed within immediate areas adjacent to the dunes or in the dune area, such as low-profile luminaries on crossovers for safety purposes. It would probably eliminate the opportunity for dune edge lighting on the yard side of dunes. So there would be some consequences compared to what we have now to allowances. It would tighten up requirements. But again, it would be a matter of whether or not that would be an effective, necessarily have some positive effect on sea turtle protection. And at this point, staff doesn't think that warrants that elimination of lighting opportunity. And finally, it would be problematic from an enforcement access standpoint to regulate the dune, and that the beach, which is currently regulated, is essentially a public accessible space that is regularly monitored by the county through its sea turtle protection habitat plan, whereas dune areas are private property and they're not readily accessible for enforcement. So those are the main reasons why staff does not support inclusion of the dune. And as such, the draft ordinance that we're presenting does not include that revision to include the dune. There are other proposed revisions in the amendment that staff has looked at including, there's a clarification that's written in on the tinted or film glass visible transmittance. We added a clarification on how it's measured by center of glass. And in this, we worked with the county building official at how it's required in the building code. So that's more of a clarification for contractors. We also looked at the purpose section of the regulations and included a reference to impacts to adult sea turtles as well as hatchlings. That's based on just scientific information. It's just a matter of taking this opportunity to include that. We also looked at referencing the county's sea turtle habitat conservation plan. The enforcement of these lighting requirements is an integral part of the plan, and we're taking this opportunity to make that cross-reference. We're also looking at revising the beachfront lighting approval procedures to be consistent with building inspection procedures as it occurs when we're reviewing sea turtle lighting compliance. In the end, we're recommending that the Planning and Zoning Commission recommend that the Board of County Commissioners adopt the proposed ordinance amendments. And if you have any questions, we'd be happy to answer them. Thank you.
Any members of the commission have any questions, comments to staff?
The people are going to be affected by this ordinance. Have any of them been contacted? Or is this just kind of something that they'll hear about later?
We sent notification to representatives of the South Beach Association, North Beach, a group. We've notified people who have expressed an interest in this issue. So we have gotten feedback from our direct notification to Barrier Island associations, and we have gotten some feedback from them.
But not directly to the homeowners.
We did not send a direct notification to every oceanfront homeowner, no.
Okay. Thank you.
Any other questions or comments?
One question. Roland, how many code enforcement citations were issued for turtle lighting violations in 2014, if you know?
There's one citation, and that's the one referenced here.
Okay.
Let me just say, from an enforcement standpoint on sea turtle lighting, there's various aspects to that. We have the Sea Turtle Habitat Conservation Plan, and as part of that, we have staff and consultants regularly monitoring, doing sea turtle nesting monitoring. And as part of that process, they note if there's any sea turtle lighting issues, and they report that to code enforcement staff. Each year, code enforcement staff send out letters to each oceanfront property owner and to remind them that if they're entering sea turtle season and that these are the requirements, and remind them that they have to comply. We do get reports from the monitors, and we do fairly frequently send follow-up courtesy letters and contact people when we have violations come to our attention, and most of the time the owners are responsive and comply on that level. We did have a few, I think we had 3 formal code enforcement cases last year relating to condominium developments, where those condominium developments did come into compliance prior to any fines being imposed. So I just want to give that context. While there was one citation issued last year, there were other enforcement actions that occurred.
Okay.
I do have a couple of minor suggested changes to your language. And these are born of the paranoia that I developed over years of listening to attorneys' arguments on issues and coming to realize that if there is any possible opening left, then that argument will be made at some point sooner or later. When I was reading the package the staff put together, and I read the language
which is visible to an observer on the beach or within line of sight of an observer on the beach. I was a little bit concerned because I could imagine some attorney arguing someday that it all depends on where the observer is. If the observer's here, maybe they can see. If the observer's over here, maybe they can't. And that creates some type of ambiguity in the ordinance. And I wondered if I was just being overly paranoid. Then I read the next page of the staff presentation, and I see that whoever drafted the Vero Beach ordinance saw that exact issue as well, because they said detectable to an observer standing anywhere on the beach. And that's the first proposal I would make, to put that language there to leave it absolutely clear that if it can be seen from any vantage point on the beach, then it is an illumination, or it is something subject to the ordinance. And the second thing, if you look at the ordinance itself, which is toward the end of your package, it's the second page of the proposed ordinance at the top. It says floodlights shall be prohibited, and it says all exterior light fixtures on the seaward and the shore perpendicular sides of the building, and then in parentheses, and on the landward side. I think those two ands should be ors. I think that's your intent, because if it's on the seaward and the shore perpendicular side, someone could argue someday it has to be on both. And in parentheses, again, that and, I think, is intended to be an alternative, standalone alternative. So I'd propose those two ands be changed to or. And I say that, as we're about to open the public hearing, in case anybody wants to comment on those proposed changes.
I'd just say that from staff's perspective, you're exactly right on the and or, and staff would have no objection to the other suggestion as well, the first one.
I'm going to go ahead and open the public hearing. This is a legislative matter. Would any member of the public like to be heard on this matter? If so, come forward. Please state your name and address.
Good evening, Mr. Chairman. My name is Miles Conway, 2340 South A1A.
Would you pull the mic just a little bit higher, Mr.
Sure.
Chairman? Thank you.
2340 South Highway A1A. I've lived on the beach next to Round Island Park for the last 23 years. I've come before the Planning and Zoning Commission tonight representing the South Beach Property Homeowners Association and the Indian River Neighbourhood Association. I am Secretary and a Director of the South Beach Property Owners Association, also Chairman of the Land Use Committee, and I'm also a member of the Land Use Committee of the Indian River Neighbourhood Association.
Mr. Conway, could you be sworn by the clerk, please?
Sure.
Thank you.
Thank you. No, it's fine, either way. Just raise your right hand, please. Do you swear or affirm to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, I've prepared a presentation to reflect the views and the positions of both civic associations, and to address Mr. Brognano's issue of have we contacted the various homeowners, etc. Our area of coverage in terms of our constituents is about 2,400 constituents in the South Beach area, stretching all the way from the county line all the way up to the moorings. And it's my understanding the Indian River Neighbourhood Association covers constituents all the way up to Indian River Shores. The one civic association that I thought was coming tonight was the North Beach Property Owners Association, but they haven't shown up so far. So I think we've got the whole Barrier Island from county line to county line covered in terms of that. Okay. Our presentation tonight is the proposed sea turtle protection lighting regulations, but in the context of commercial transient boarding houses operating residential neighbourhoods. The reason we've made this distinction is because a new animal has shown up in our neighbourhood since 2012. Traditionally, the citations and concerns with lighting illumination onto sea turtle nests and nestlings would have just come from bona fide residents who have been part-time residents or actually just use their properties for living in, typical families. However, the new animal that's shown up in our neighbourhoods that was approved by the Board of County Commissioners on July 10th, 2012 was what they euphemistically referred to as vacation rentals as a result of the state of Florida legalizing these entities in 2011. So what we have now is we have commercial transient boarding houses operating in residential neighbourhoods close to the ocean, or in fact in some cases right on the ocean. So what you have now is you have a different type of, let's call it transgressor or abuser of the lighting regulations, and we need to make that distinction. I'm going to read a statement on behalf of the Indian River Neighbourhood Association that the chairman and president couldn't have been here this evening, but just before I do that, I'd like to make sure that we don't lose the plot of what we're trying to do over here. On the left-hand side, you will see two photographs of disorientated turtles as a result of being disorientated by lights. What they do is, instead of migrating once they come out of their shells, instead of migrating towards the ocean, they migrate towards parking lots or the dune or landward rather than seaward, and they die in the process of dehydration, compared to the nestling on the right-hand side that isn't subject to a light illumination that ultimately makes it to the beach. So not to lose the plot, we want to enhance the photograph on the right and minimize the photograph on the left. At the same time, we'd like to see situations like this, where the young adult on the right actually gets to an adult age rather than the young adult on the left at the feet of our former marine biologist, Mr. Rick Heron, where that adult male turtle got consumed plastic and various fishing netting and starved to death because it couldn't ingest food anymore. So this is very much an endangered species, and we were trying to do everything that we possibly can to ensure the continuity of the species. With that in mind, the statement that comes from the Indian River Neighbourhood Association that states, the Indian River Neighbourhood Association has been very concerned about transient rentals occurring in unincorporated county, and the matter before you tonight is directly related. The protection of sea turtles in their critical habitat regarding lighting or illumination, visible, beach, or however you choose to define it. It is generally believed people renting homes on the ocean front are renting specifically for their enjoyment of the beach. However, these renters have little or no knowledge of sea turtle nesting and their critical habitat, which is in the beach in front of their rental dwellings. This questionable lack of knowledge potentially erases any protections we give the sea turtles. Let us be clear, this statement is in no way intended to disparage or slight these renters. These remarks are only to identify the problem. Further, when there are multiples of people renting for short periods of time, such as a week or a long weekend, the problem increases in proportion to the number of rentals. And we find the problem is exacerbated when these transient rentals cater to events where many people are present at the same time, crowding the rental property. It is not unusual for activities to extend to the beach. So long as the county allows these events and multiple renters in short periods of time, it also allows a situation to exist which poses a very real threat to the sea turtle population. We are fully in support of regulating these transient rentals on many issues, but time is not on our side when we consider the impact these rentals have on sea turtles. These impacts being the direct result of a lack of knowledge of our regulation. The problem must be recognized and a solution brought forward as soon as possible. Roland has done a lot of work bringing you proposed amendments to the regulations, and we'd like to say a sincere thank you. We are now asking you to enhance these proposed amendments by recognizing the impact of transient rentals on sea turtles, and we offer a simple solution. It basically presents a four-step outline. First, to recognize regulations exist to protect the turtles, to explain why regulations are necessary and to identify them. Second is to state the consequences for failure to adhere to the regulations, as in all code enforcements. Third is to identify the owner of the property as the responsible party for notifying the renter of these regulations. Fourth, establishes the owner of the property as the responsible party for all compliance and non-compliance matters. The significance of this four-step outline is to assure the occupants of the rental dwellings have knowledge of our regulation and that it applies to them also. It is our position that the owners of the property, as well as the renters and their guests, have the same responsibility all of us have, and that is to protect these endangered turtles, their critical habitat, the nesting sites, and the hatchlings as they journey to the sea. This is a round-the-clock responsibility throughout the nesting season, and our regulations need to be reflective of that fact. We feel adding this matter to your proposed amendment is justified because it would make the amendment comprehensive and provide the protection for sea turtles by acknowledging where threats may originate and then providing the solution. Ignorance of the law cannot be excused, just as damage to sea turtles, their nest or hatchlings cannot be undone. Please consider adding this. Thank you. And that was on the part of the President, Mrs. Honey Manous, and I was hoping one of the Indian River Neighbourhood Association directors would be here, should you have any questions, but I'll field them for that civic organisation before I get on to my own.
Any questions of Mr. Conway with respect to that part of the statement?
Yes.
Okay.
Do you have a correlation between vacation rentals and violations or anything else that ties the two together? That the more the vacation rentals occur, the more sea turtle lighting violations occur?
In terms of actual statistics, Mr. DeBron?
Well, you're asking us to put that in the ordinance, and you're making the statement saying that, the vacation rentals are to blame for sea turtle violations. And I didn't know if you had any evidence or anything else to support that assertion.
No, what we have focused on in terms of members of our association or oceanfront homeowners is that we have a group, particularly in the South Beach area, that for the last 22 years we get Mr. de Blois' letter advising us of our downlights, advising us of to close our curtains and observe the various regulations, and we are experienced in it. So as a result of that, in terms of our group, our cohort of properties in our particular area, if we see a neighbour, for example, that we know, and he's out on vacation or he's not at the property, we will immediately contact him and say, look, this is a sea turtle nest, close your windows. However, in our particular area, what has undone our efforts at complying with the regulations is a transient rental behind us that lights up like a Christmas tree when a new batch of renters come in and project their lights right over our properties onto the nests. So the situation that we have is that the correlation in our particular area of where we see lights illuminating do not come from the full-time or the bona fide residents, they come from the transient rentals. And we've seen this for a stretch of area going from the county line all the way up 3 or 4 miles up the coast. Whether that is generalized to the rest of the way up the Barrier Island, I was hoping that the North Beach Property Owners Association would come because we've had that. To answer your question, the correlation that we do have is the correlation with the parking problem that we've had where there's excess parking spilling over into the right-of-ways, into the private-public right-of-ways, is directly correlated to the same groups of people that violate the lighting ordinances. So that's the correlation. The problem in other areas related to the transient rentals occur or manifest themselves not only in parking, noise, disturbances, but also in sea turtle disorientations.
Okay, and Roland, do you have any evidence that supports the assertions as far as vacation rentals have more violations of sea turtle lighting than anybody else or any other group, hotels, condominiums, etc.?
No, we don't have that data.
Yeah. Well, the problem that Mr. de Blois faces in that is that there are 510 vacation rentals advertised on vacation rental by owner, HomeAway, Airbnb in Indian River County, and there are only 32 licenses issued by the state of Florida to conduct vacation rentals. So Mr. de Blois' statistics on lighting violations could come from a transient boarding house or a vacation rental, but Mr. de Blois wouldn't know it.
Okay.
because 90% of properties that are boarding houses at the moment are unlicensed. There's 470 vacation rentals operating.
I don't want to get too far into the vacation rental. I want to try and stay.
I'm just pointing out
let me finish,
it's
please.
a very difficult question for Mr. De Bloy to answer because he doesn't know who he's dealing with.
Thank you.
Okay.
Continue, please, Mr.
All right. Okay, so let's try and address the problem specifically over here, how we will actually know in certain cases where these are the illumination is directly correlated or is directly responsible by a vacation rental. Mr. Chairman, what you are seeing over here is a section of A1A just north of the moorings and south of Round Island Park in approximately the area of 1880 South Highway A1A, where a transient boarding operator uses his property, which is a 1 acre piece of property, for hosting wedding functions. Okay, so what they do is they park on the side of the road, and staff is now preparing a couple of ordinances that differentiate between parking and events to embargo event activity at single-family residences facing the ocean and just generally through the county. What transpires over here is that the recommendations or the actual testimony, the first-hand testimony of the people that have actually rented these transient boarding houses in this particular case for this wedding actually provide their own testimony as to what they are doing on the beach. So in this case, our wedding had around 50 guests, and we did the ceremony and reception on the beachfront lawn. The beachfront lawn in this particular case is the dune. Nice alternative to actually being on the beach with cocktail hour around the pool, etc., etc. So we have first-hand evidence of how these people are actually using the dune area during turtle nesting season itself. So this was a case of a distinction to Mr. De Braal's point. How do we know that this is related to a transient boarding house? Well, you had first-hand evidence from the people that actually used the property and how they were using the property, and subsequently we'll provide you with additional photographic evidence. Okay? One of our recommendations to be consistent with what staff is doing at the moment is with the parking regulation. One of our recommendations is we would like to see the ordinance for the turtle regulations to be differentiated between citations or regulations for people using their own properties to live in, as opposed to homeowners using the property as transient boarding houses or event functions. Because currently, one of the citation that Mr. De Bloy mentioned that occurred was a $50 violation per day for 5 days, which came up to $250 for the period that the illumination violations occurred. This is a parking fine in terms of the thousands of dollars that they pay per day. It is insignificant. It is not a deterrent. It's not going to protect the turtles in terms of how much is assessed. We are proposing, and we would like to suggest to staff and to this board, that just as you are dealing in differentiating between bona fide residents, or in this particular case, as you say, for a vacation rental dwelling, the moment they make that transition from actually getting a license as opposed to operating without a license, that they are now a vacation rental, there should be a different set of standards, because you're dealing with different type of people abusing and not adhering to the regulations.
Are you suggesting that there be greater penalties on people coming and using vacation rentals? Is that what you're saying?
Yes, very much so, because the ultimate responsibility is with the property owner. What you have here is you have de facto a property owner that's using his residence as a de facto unsupervised motel or hotel. And if you recall, Mr. Polakowicz, when the Board of County Commissioners relaxed the regulation, the whole point of contention at that stage was the 30-day ordinance as to whether it was a motel or a hotel. And that was relieved now to something less than 30 days, was now classified as a vacation rental. But de facto, in terms of functionality and the way these residents are used, they are actually unsupervised motels or hotels operating in residential neighborhoods. If it's
Let me ask Mr. DeBrawl a question.
Yes, sir.
In the recesses of my memory from the county attorney days, I seem to recall that the state preempted the regulation of vacation rentals to the state.
Correct.
Okay. If we were to adopt something as urged by Mr. Conway, was it? Yes, Mr. Conway, basically saying if you have a vacation rental, you must post a sign or you must do something about these turtle regulations. In your opinion, would that be something that violates the state preemption of that area?
No, the preemption has to do with length of stay and those things. We're free to regulate as far as parking, as far as signage. We can go ahead and do more as far as registration if we would like to, and make further requirements of the vacation rental owner as long as we stay away from length and duration of stay.
Okay.
and existence, and the legal authority on that is SB3, Florida statute SB 356, or the Thrasher Amendment that was passed in June of 2014. That gave home rule back to the county with the exception of existence, duration, and frequency.
Okay.
But my bigger concern, following up on that, would be how would you differentiate between a vacation rental owner and a condominium owner, something like that? How would you be able to come up with the vacation rental being a different class that is deserving of a higher fine? You know, if I park my car in a handicap spot, I'm taking a spot away from a handicapped person, therefore I should get a higher fine. But if I park my car taking up 2 regular parking spaces, what's to differentiate? You know, how is one person being a worse actor than another and deserving of a higher fine?
It's very simple. The differentiating factor is that the person parking it is actually paying a fee for the right to be in that parking spot. And that's it's no different, Mr. DeBrawl, from what you're doing with the parking. You're differentiating from the fact that the person that's parking in the right-of-way, clogging up the emergency lane, etc., not parking in the driveway, is somebody that is paying the owner of that property a fee to board in that house for a particular period of time, as opposed to a guest of a resident that's using that parking space to come and have dinner. It's very simple. The differentiating factor is the one is used for commercial profit-generating purposes,
legal,
and the other is not.
It's
okay,
a legal
we're getting way too far afield on parking, because we're not here about parking.
I understand.
I'm trying to distill down to understand exactly what you're asking us.
Well,
I think the first thing you said was that you would like some form of notice required to the occupants of these vacation rentals about the turtle ordinance. Okay. And number 2, you wanted essentially greater penalties.
Correct.
Okay. What other things, if any, do you want?
Getting on to it now.
Okay.
Okay. All right. Moving on. So here is the parking issue that Mr. DeBrawl was talking about over here. This is another instance where you have a whole group of people that are not educated, have not lived on the ocean, that have a great time in a wedding reception, imbibe, etc., leave the blinds open and shine right onto the turtle nesting. It's the incumbent upon and the responsibility of the owner of that property to ensure that the turtle regulations are adhered to the same standard as the neighbor next door who's using his property as his home, not as a motel. Right. And as I say, here's another example of how you differentiate on the parking. Now, there's a second case here now where in our residential neighborhoods, the traditional notion or the romantic notion that these residences are now being used as a good, happy time for vacations. What has happened, Mr. Polakwich, is that these neighborhoods are now being used for industrial or commercial purposes other than lodging houses. What you're seeing is a homeowner, oceanfront homeowner, that rents his property out for the purposes of film production or advertisement production. So you'll get a whole film crew that actually stays in the property for a week. They haul out their film equipment, their illumination equipment in turtle season, right on the dune, not even on the beach. This is a photograph of this particular transient rental right on the beach, and this will talk to our recommendation a little bit later on to include the dune and the berm in the definition of the beach. That's our second request. So that is one case. Then, as I say, here's another situation now where we are dealing with the commercialization or industrialization, that what you have over here is for wedding receptions or events that Mr. de Braal and staff are now addressing to ban these events, but they are still going to be conducted, is you have these receptions taking place right on the beach. There's the canopy. This is the lawn that they were talking about. This, Mr. de Blois, is on Reef Road, which is a beach that's not accreting. It's always been a problem beach. This is where a number of incidental take permits have been issued as a result of seawall construction. So they're actually on the dune, and this is one of the points of contention that we're raising, that we believe that the dune should be included in the definition. The reason we are including this, because we addressed to staff when we got the draft ordinance, we made a statement to Mr. de Blois, due to the fact the dune is part of the beach system and the sea turtles frequently lay their eggs as far west as the dune itself, the dune area needs to be stipulated as a protected area as part of the beach definition. Now, Mr. de Blois' points are well taken. He said that in his slide, and we reflected it in our slide as well, be inconsistent with the state model, effectively eliminate allowances within the areas, be problematic of enforcement access standpoint of view. Those are all very legitimate, but they are dated and archaic in the sense that those criteria would apply to normal residents living in their homes. Again, we have a different animal now in terms of these transient rentals. So we took this position to a higher authority. We took this to the Department of Interior and indicated to them that currently staff has a position that the dune should not be included in the definition of the beach. And we got a response back from the US Fish and Wildlife to the effect, Dr. Conway, taking of nesting sea turtle hatchlings or incubating nests is of concern to the service, regardless of whether they are located on the berm or dune portion of the beach. And this came from the coastal wildlife biologist at 20th Street. So it's according to the position of the Department of Interior under the Endangered Species Act, the berm and the dune is part of the area that should be protected. As staff and Mr. de Blois referenced the state model, we escalated this up to the state to get an opinion on what was the intent of the state model. Dr. Robert Trindell, who runs the Imperil Species Management, responded to us and said, Dear Dr. Conway, I'm writing to respond to your request to clarify the recommendation in the state's model lighting ordinance, Florida Administrative Code Rule 62B55, include a prohibition on lights on the dune. She states, the goal of the model lighting ordinance is to limit the impacts of landward sea lights on nesting sea turtles and hatchlings. Any lights that are visible from the areas where sea turtle nests could harm or take, leading the turtles away from the water where they perish. Do sea turtles nest in the dune? Well, our association and I personally stated yes, because I've had first-hand observation that in certain cases in our Creeding Beach next to Round Island Park, I've had a sea turtle nest right underneath my dune, walk over right on my dune, because it was more of a protected area from the crabs, etc., and I've observed this in a number of cases. The professional marine biologists, sea turtles nest in unconsolidated sand that is accessible from the mean high water. This includes both beach berm and seaward dune area. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service recently designated critical habitat for the loggerhead sea turtle, defining the nesting beach as the extratidal or dry sandy beaches from the mean high water line to the toe of the secondary dune. Green sea turtles are more likely to crawl farther up the beach, depositing their eggs on the seaward face of the steep dune or farther in the dune field. Therefore, recent assessments of empirical data confirm that both loggerheads and green sea turtles will nest in the dune, including areas landward of the frontal dune. empirical correlated data, Mr. de Braal. I've seen this for the last 10 years happen, that these turtles actually nest on the dune, right underneath my dune walkover, going all the way over to the lifeguard station adjacent to Round Island Park. The model standards for existing beachfront lighting clearly states that the goal of the model lighting ordinance is to provide the highest level of protection for nesting marine turtles and their hatchlings, and directs local government to ensure that the point source of light of any reflective surface of the light fixture is not directly visible. While this portion of the rule does mention the beach, the goal of the beach in this statement is to ensure that light is not visible from areas where the sea turtle nests, which we know includes both the beach and the dune area. So this is from the horse's mouth, or in the case, the turtle's mouth, that the dune, both from US Fish and Wildlife and from the Florida model, that the dune area needs to be protected. And I would invite Mr. de Bloy, Mr. Bowling, Mr. de Braal to come down to Round Island Park, and we will show you that in a Creeding Beach situation, we have nests, as we speak, on the dune, and they are exposed to lights. Not only from transient rentals, but from normal residents as well. So, Mr. Chairman, that is the next recommendation that we would like to include. Now, the final recommendation is, you've hit the nail on the head, Chairman Polakwich, in that being a lawyer, you understand the games. The next part that we are recommending is the position of the South Beach in terms of the Code Enforcement Board protocol. And what we are saying, what we are referring to is a very popular TV series called Breaking Bad, where there is an attorney that gets his client off in every single matter under the sun by gaming the legal system, and in particularly the case of the Code Enforcement Board. So in this case, what we are recommending is that the code enforcement hearing should, the code and whatever comes out of this and the Board of County Commissioners is got to be so robust that it will stand up to the ins and outs and the gaming of the system at the Code Enforcement Board, because unfortunately our Code Enforcement Board consists of 2 electricians, a general contractor, somebody that's had real estate experience, I believe recently an engineer, and somebody that's involved in insurance. There's nobody over there that has an inkling about sea turtle lighting, or a marine biologist, or anybody that's competent in that area. And what I would like to recommend...
Dr. Conway, these are volunteers that volunteer their time for the county, and I don't think it's right for you to disparage their volunteer time, just like the people that are sitting up here tonight.
Yeah, we've gone over this before, Mr. de Braal. I'm not disparaging them. I'm pointing out the facts that the work product of this committee can be as robust as it possibly can if the agency that is regulating and enforcing the codes is not au fait with the circumstances that they are dealing with. The work of this committee is nullified, and the work of any code is going to be nullified. That is the point I've made before, and I will make it again. And I would like to...
And I'll make the same comment again.
It's fine.
Okay, guys.
Okay,
Let's get back on point.
we've dealt with this issue before. Okay, it doesn't alter the facts on the ground. And what I would like to recommend as a solution to this, Chairman Polakwich, is the model that is used at the City of Vero Beach. And this actually occurred yesterday as well. One of the issues that they are dealing with is this whole problem of the transient rentals. And every time you get a situation where you have a commercial operator that has a significant stake involved in continuing to be able to rent these transient boarding houses, they bring in attorneys because the stake is very, very high, and they will make expenditures and fund a legal defense. The situation that you have before our Code Enforcement Board is very unfair on staff, and particularly Mr. de Bloy. Mr. de Bloy is not a trial attorney. He is a veteran code enforcement officer and an environmental protection officer. When you have situations in the City of Vero Beach and in other jurisdictions as well, where a complicated issue like this is brought, and it's a specialist issue, they bring in external counsel as their prosecutor So as an example, yesterday where we had this case of 4 or 5 transient renters contesting fines that they're not following the 30-day ordinance in the city of Vero Beach, they brought in this attorney, Nicholas Zabrazing, who used to be from the Office of the State Attorney, who actually used to be a judicial circuit. So one of our recommendations is where you have a situation where a transient boarding operator brings an attorney in to defend against a code enforcement citation, whether it be parking or whether it be in terms of the sea turtle, that the playing field needs to be leveled in that an attorney then needs to present the case as well, so that Mr. de Blois doesn't have to have 3 hats on as a code enforcement officer, a marine biologist, and a trial attorney. We feel it's very unfair on Mr. de Blois, that the playing field needs to be leveled.
Okay.
And those are our recommendations, sir.
Okay. Thank you. Any specific questions to Mr. Conway? Okay. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
Anybody else like to be heard on this matter? Okay. Hearing none, we'll close the public hearing. Members of the commission? Let's start here. Because if we try to swallow the whole thing in one bite, that might be a little bit difficult. We had staff recommendation. I suggested some minor changes to staff recommendation, at least as far as that went. Is the commission generally in agreement with staff's recommendation, at least as to the language of the turtle protection ordinance and the minor changes I suggested?
I am.
Yes.
Okay. So let's take this in sections. I'll entertain then a motion to approve the language of the changes that was a motion to approve the language proposed by staff with the minor amendment that I made. I'll start with a motion there. Someone like to make that motion?
Make a motion to approve staff recommendations with the modifications made by the chairman.
Okay, we have a motion by Mr. Brognano. Do we have a second?
I'll second.
Do we have any discussion on that motion? Anybody wish to be heard on that motion? We will consider your points, Mr. Conway. I'm just trying to take this one step at a time. Okay, then, all in favor of the motion, please signify by aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Hearing none, that motion carries. Now, as I understand it, Mr. Conway has proposed several different items. One is some type of notice requirement to owners who rent out their properties for transient vacation rentals. And Mr. DeBrawl, again, my memory's not all that good on this subject, but this is 30 days or less.
Correct.
Is that right? Okay.
Yes.
So if somebody has a condominium and leases it for 2 months, that's not a vacation rental, but it's somebody else living in the unit for 2
Correct.
months or 3 months or 4 months or 6 months or whatever the heck.
That's
Might be
right.
a year. Okay. Now,
Just taking that one step further, because there are 3 people missing, for it to be affirmative action of this board, it would have to be a unanimous vote. In other words, 4-0. 3-1 would not consider board action, but it will still go forward as a recommendation.
as a
of the Board of County
recommendation,
Commissioners.
correct. And just so we're clear, all of this is simply our recommendation on the matter to the Board of County Commissioners.
Very correct.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
If I could, on the notice issue, I think, one of the recommendations that I understood from IRNA was a notice issue, and 2 thoughts came to mind. Nothing that would need to go into the code, but it could certainly be directed to staff from the Board of County Commissioners. One is, as Roland mentioned, every year prior to the nesting season, we send out letters reminding owners of the requirements for sea turtle lighting. We could add to that, just to address the issue that as owner, they're responsible for actions of anyone on the property. It could be a guest, could be a renter. It doesn't matter if it's a renter for 3 months, a renter for 3 days, a guest. Lights, whoever turns on the light has the same effect on a turtle. Turtle doesn't care who's turning on the light and who's not turning it off. So we could make it explicit in that annual letter, and picking up another idea that wouldn't have to go into the code but could just be procedure. Our own staff procedure right now is that if we become aware that someone may be operating a vacation rental, we contact the person and we contact the state, and the state starts an investigation to see if they need a state license or not. If they go through the process, and we've had, I think, 4 in the last 3 years get state licenses, we send out a letter to them and talk about what our parking requirements are. We could add to that letter, if they're east of A1A, sea turtle lighting kind of procedures, and that they would be responsible to pass that on to the renter. That's a kind of a practical procedural thing that I think would make sense in what we're doing now, and it would be a way of getting that information to oceanfront owners every year and to any vacation rental licensee east of A1A. So I think the notice is easy enough to do and to fit into our protocol.
And that first notice that you talked about, that I think you said, and I just want to confirm that I heard it correctly, that notice goes out to every beachfront owner in the county.
That's correct.
So you could add language to that saying, if your property will be occupied by guests, renters, whatever, anybody other than yourself, you are still responsible. You should notify them, advise them of the requirements of the turtle ordinance. Yeah. Okay.
That just seemed to be a practical way to fit it into our protocol.
Okay. So I'm a little bit concerned about trying to single out vacation rentals from other situations where a unit or a house may be occupied by someone other than the owner. It seems to me if you buy into the principle, then you got to get everybody who might be occupying the property as a non-owner. The suggestion that was just made by staff, how do the members of the commission feel about that?
I'm okay with it.
It's reasonable. It can't hurt.
Okay, why don't we then, the chair will entertain a motion then to recommend to the Board of County Commissioners that the notice to non-owner occupants, as described by Mr. Bowling, would be included in the annual letter to oceanfront property owners. Can I get a motion to that effect?
I get a motion to forward over to the Board of County Commissioners Stan Bowling's recommendation to property owners, so they have to let any kind of renter or visitor to their property know that they have to comply with the turtle ordinance, and any violations will be theirs to pay.
Okay. We have a motion by Mr. Brugnano. Do we have a second?
Second.
By Ms. Calderon. Is it Calderon?
That's right.
Calderon. Okay. Any discussion on the motion?
Do you want to put in what the penalties are, which was one of
Well,
his concerns?
we're going to get there. I'm
In
taking.
that letter, I meant, if you violate it, then, these are the things you as a property owner will face, regardless of whether it's you, your family, a renter, a long-term renter.
Does you
short-term.
notice in reminding owners of the turtle ordinance typically cover language about penalties?
I don't think we get into dollar amounts. Roland?
I think there's a bit generic language that there's penalties of potentially up to $250 per day. That's based on Florida Statute 162.
Okay.
As Dr. Connolly had mentioned, back in 1992, the county adopted a fee schedule ordinance for fines, and it is currently, as it was back in 1992, $50 per day specific to sea turtle violations when a citation is issued. If it goes to a code board, the board can issue up to $250 per day. But
Right.
the answer to the question is there's a general reference to fines in the letter.
Yeah, which would be, I think, typical anyways. Any other comments, suggestions? Okay, we have a motion then. All in favor of the motion, please signify by aye. Aye. Any opposed? Hearing none, that motion carries again as a recommendation of the board. I'm sorry, Dr. Conway.
Yeah. Mr. Chairman, on the fine issue, if I could please be recognized, because there was another document from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife on the issue of fines that I forgot to mention. Could I have a minute just to show?
Well, let us get through these items. Unless it's relevant to this next point, because the next point, as I understood you were requesting that essentially the penalties or fines be greater in vacation rental situations than in other situations. Is your point relevant to that issue?
Very relevant.
Okay, go ahead.
Very relevant to that. And I'm sorry, I forgot. I just got a little sidetracked with our discussion on the Code Enforcement Board. What you have going on, Mr. Chairman, is that there are two layers of enforcement that are occurring at the same time. The county has jurisdiction in terms of enforcing the code enforcement, the lighting, under their lighting ordinance. The Department of Interior, under the Endangered Species Act, has their law enforcement officers also in operation, also enforcing the take, because they operate under the incidental take permit under the Habitat Conservation Plan that has been granted to the county. And their fines, if there's take or disorientation or evidence of disorientation, and I'm waiting for the letter to come up, is in the range of $100,000 or a year in jail. Mm-hmm. So if and this gets back to the Code Enforcement Board issue, that if the ordinances that you now approve, and they are rigid ordinances and very robust ordinances, and they go before the Code Enforcement Board, and the Code Enforcement Board does not implement those fines accordingly, the Fish and Wildlife have the ability to ignore that and then go to the owner and impose an incidental take permit fine and fine them in greater quantities, much greater quantities than what we're talking about. And I'd just like to bring up the letter and show you exactly what I'm talking about, because this was issued yesterday by the Fish and Wildlife to one of the renters that the citation was, the $250 citation was issued. So if you'll just give me a minute, I'll bring it up for you.
Well, as I understand the point that you were making, it is not to increase fines generally for all. It is to impose greater fines on this class of violator compared to any other class of violator.
That is correct.
Okay.
That is correct.
I don't understand, though, why we would treat one differently than the other. I mean, I understand the transient thing and how it bothers you, but let's say I am a property owner and I decide I'm going to have this big party. Why should my fine be less
because the fine to the resident that's used his house for a number of years is of greater impact and deterrence, as opposed to a commercial business that is operating and is charging $1,000 a day, that if they get a $250 fine, it's an operating expense. It's like a parking ticket. But compared to a private homeowner, for example, that's just a condominium owner that went out on vacation or an emergency and he left his blinds open for 3 or 4 days and got hit with a $250 fine, that's a significant penalty to them.
Isn't the net effect the same to the turtle?
I'm sorry?
Isn't the net effect the same to the turtle?
Yeah, the net effect is exactly the same to the turtles.
I understand why you're frustrated with transient, but the two don't make any sense to me, because if it's to protect a turtle, whether you're an incidental person who just forgot once, or you rent one all year round and you only have 2 days of fine, what's the difference?
Because the propensity amongst the transient renters is greater than against the individual.
I don't disagree, but I think that's hard to write.
I beg your pardon?
I don't disagree, but I think that's hard to write.
Okay, well, I mean, that's why we got the lawyers.
Let me move things along. Is there any member of the commission who wants to have further discussion or consideration of the notion of greater penalties for vacation rental violators? If not, then I think we're going to drop that issue, because we're just taking time up on something that the commission is not interested in. The next item that was mentioned was including the dune within the ordinance. Any thoughts?
If I could just say something on an issue that I didn't get into in my presentation. Again, the specific direction on this amendment relates to sea turtle lighting. We do have other provisions in our coastal management element that relates to protection of the dune from uses that physically affect the dune. So there is some protection of the dune. Particularly, there's reference to sea turtle nests and sometimes making the way into the dune past the frontal dune. There was a picture shown of a canopy set up which appeared to be on the dune. that would be covered under other sections of the code related to dune protection. So I just want to make that distinction. There seemed to be a mixing somewhat of dune direct impacts and how that might affect the habitat and the protected species and the sea turtle lighting issue itself. And I think actually one way of looking at it is, or one thing to point out is, those photos that were shown of those examples of dune impacts were taken from the beach. So if there were lights associated with those uses, it would seem you would also be able to see them from the beach as well as from the dune. So there is that point that staff considered in making its evaluation and recommendation to not include dunes at this point.
And I'm trying to recall your earlier presentation. Are you aware of any, I know you've done a survey to compile language from the various ordinances, but is anyone else extending the illumination portion of these sea turtle regulations to visible from the dune?
One thing we looked at, the State Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission actually has a web page that's like a clearinghouse of all local sea turtle lighting ordinances in the state. There's about 95 of them.
Yeah.
Didn't look at every single one of them, but I did look beyond just the local ones that I summarized in my table, and I could not find any that went above and beyond the state model ordinance to include dune in that illumination restriction area. So it would seem to me at this point that it would be a precedent statewide if we did.
It would create, as I understand it, given that we have different municipalities with jurisdiction here, none of which go to that point, we're going to have a patchwork along the beach. Yes, the dune, no the dune, yes, the dune, no the dune, which, to me is not necessarily not an optimum situation.
Again, if I could just comment and follow up on what Roland was saying, I think if you go from our current code, which is 2 feet above the level of the beach, to an observer standing anywhere on the beach, you've got a higher vantage point, and that might be taken into account with the model ordinance, that you would have somebody whose vantage point is 5.5 to 6 feet above the surface of the beach and be able to see violations that would cover more than just the beach surface itself. So staff feels comfortable with what we recommend.
Okay. Does any member of the commission wish to extend or recommend an extension of the ordinance to include the dune?
I do not.
I do not.
Okay, we'll drop that issue.
And I'd just add that in code 932.06 paren 2, encroachment or ingress disturbance on the dune provides for it being illegal to encroach or disturb caused by individuals upon foot or by vehicle of any kind. Yeah. So our code has a provision if somebody is foolish enough to stand on the dune, they can be cited with a code violation.
I mean, there's part of me that's thinking pretty much back what staff suggested, that it's hard to get into regulating what's observable from the dune when there are restrictions on your ability to go upon the dune. Okay. And the last item that was raised, as I understand it, was basically to recommend that in turtle ordinance enforcement actions before code, that we recommend that the county employ an attorney to present that issue to the Code Enforcement Board. Now, again, recalling my former days, I know the Code Enforcement Board has its own attorney, and then separately, and actually the Code Enforcement Board, I'm recalling this as I speak, but the county attorney's office is the attorney. No, we're not. We're not the attorney for the Code Enforcement Board. We hire outside counsel for that.
Correct, we do. We advise staff.
Right, okay.
Code enforcement staff.
In any event, first of all, is there any such provision regarding any other violation of any ordinance that we have, that an attorney shall be or should be employed for that enforcement?
There's no specification in any policy or code Just for a point of reference, the Code Board meets monthly. There's anywhere from 50 to 70 cases they hear when they meet. Some of the respondents are represented by attorneys, some are not. In the instance that's referenced for the sea turtle citation, we did have our sea turtle biologist as a witness for staff. So we did have that level of expertise beyond just general code enforcement in presenting the case. We did not have attorney representing the county staff in presenting the case.
You can at any time make that judgment call.
There is the opportunity to do
Yes.
that. The challenge is to determine which case in any particular month is going to warrant attorney expertise. And sometimes, in the occasion we do have attorney representations, we have pre-knowledge that it's a controversial or issue that there's going to be attorney representation by the respondent. It has happened on occasion. But lots of times people show up with attorneys. You don't know if they are or aren't when the case begins. We don't always have that knowledge in advance.
And actually, as I understood Dr. Conway's request, it was an attorney where the alleged violator is a vacation renter, because that was the example of that industry hires attorneys apparently in code enforcement actions. But let me again ask the board or the commission, does any member wish to pursue the notion of putting in the ordinance language requiring or suggesting that the code enforcement officer be represented by an attorney when he presents violations of the turtle ordinance, either generally or specifically involving vacation renters?
I do not.
No.
Okay, we'll drop that. I think we've covered everything. I think we've adopted did you have some other non-language or any other recommendations that were not included in our first motion? Let me ask you that.
No, staff had no recommendations. You all made recommendations on the language in the ordinance itself.
Correct.
And recommendations on our notice to non-owner occupants.
Okay. Then I believe we've concluded that matter. Anybody have any other issues relating to that matter?
Mr. Chairman, just the one thing, since it looks like it's wrapping up here, we anticipate scheduling consideration of this proposed ordinance before the Board of County Commissioners on August 18th or their first meeting in September, one of the two, just for anyone listening.
Actually, getting back to the dune issue, for example, or as I recall, originally the commissioners asked you to look at that. So I think in our case, we just bypassed it because no one was interested in extending. I think, did we actually have a motion not to extend it to the dune area? I don't think we did.
We didn't have a motion to that effect, no.
So just for clarity, in terms of making our recommendation to the Board of County Commissioners, we probably should have a motion then recommending that we not extend to the dune area, not extend the turtle ordinance illumination issues to the dune area.
Motion to not extend the turtle ordinance to the dune area?
Okay, we have a motion by Mr. Borgnano. Do we have a second? Second. By Mr. Stewart. Any further discussion? All in favor, please signify by aye. Aye. Any opposed? Hearing none, that motion carries. Now, at this point, Mr. Bowling, do you feel we have adequately made clear our recommendation to the Board of County Commissioners?
I do.
Okay. Next item on the agenda is item 5, Commissioners' Matters. Do we have any matters? Very good. We have the planning matters. We have the planning information package that was included in your package for the meeting. Anything, any questions, comments on the planning materials?
No.
If not, attorney matters?
No, sir.
Okay. We've reached the end of the meeting. Thank you all for attending. Meeting adjourned.